Hi everyone, Tim Ash from TTS Real Estate. Welcome to the TTS Weekly Recap. This is a short video where I cover the top questions that are asked of me from a real estate point of view on a weekly basis. This week we are covering rental increases. The three questions we're going to answer today is, under the new legislation, what needs to be done to increase the rent? How long will it take for a rental increase to take effect? How often are you allowed to increase the rent? Let's answer these questions and jump straight into it. Under the new legislation, the rent can only be increased once a year. Please keep in mind that if the tenant is on a fixed term agreement for longer than 1 year, you will have to wait for that fixed term agreement to end. So what do I mean by that? Let's say a tenant signs a 24-month lease. You can't increase the rent in 12 months' time. You would have to wait for that fixed term period to lapse before you can increase the rent. What you can do is when the tenant signs a 24-month lease, you can state that the rent is to be $400 per week for the first 12 months, and then the rent will go up to $420 per week for the second 12 months. You can put a rent, as long as you put the rental increase in at the beginning. You can't actually do it on a fixed term agreement 12 months in. You can do it if the lease obviously runs to a month-to-month basis, or if a tenant is looking to renew the lease, you can implement a rental increase off the back of that. The time you need to allow for the rental increase to take effect is a minimum 60 days. So we would issue the tenant with a 60-day rental increase notice. And under the new legislation, there are essentially 4 reasons that you can give to a tenant to state that the rent will be increased. And let's jump into those 4 reasons. So, first one is Consumer Price Index. The second reason is according to the average rent prices in Victoria, known as the Statewide Rent Index. The third reason is by a fixed percentage increase, and the fourth reason is by a fixed dollar amount. I'm going to run through each of these categories, and then I'm going to let you know my favorite, and then I'm going to let you know what happens if a tenant decides to challenge. So let's get straight into it. Firstly, Consumer Price Index. The CPI is a fixed weighted price index that relates to household expenditure on retail goods and services and other items such as housing, government charges, and consumer credit charges. The CPI is currently sitting at 6.1%. What else is sitting at 6.1%? Inflation. So CPI has a direct relation to inflation. The information that you would source if you did want to increase the rent via CPI is located on the Parliament of Australia's website. So it's directly in relation to inflation. Let's jump into number 2, the Statewide Index. This is located on the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing website. This covers rental trends on a quarterly basis and is broken up into 5 categories, being median rent, rent index, quarterly change and annual change. The median rent is an easy one. It's the lease price of the middle home in a list of properties ranked from highest to lowest in a set period of time. In this case, it would be quarterly. The rent index goes into a little bit more detail than that, and they take into consideration the type of dwellings, the different locations, and factoring in a lot of new lettings in order to give you a more sort of accurate type of data. The quarterly and annual percentage change is calculated from the rent index, otherwise known as rent indices, not the weekly rent. So they'll take into account the changes in 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms, in demographics, in geographics and property types in order to give you a more accurate overall. I believe that the second option is a little bit of an overkill for residential properties. It may be more suitable for big type commercial leases, however, not really relevant from a residential sense. Thirdly, the third option is fixed percentage increase. These can be a common approach in longer term residential or commercial leases. There aren't any restrictions on the percentage amount as long as both parties agree from the outset. So an example of this would be you may have a 5-year commercial lease. Both parties might agree that on an annual basis the rent is to increase by 3.5% per annum and to be negotiated again at the end of the 5-year lease. That can be a very much common way of doing it from a commercial sense. Lastly, which is my favourite, is by a fixed dollar amount. This means you increase the rent by what it mentions in the title, a fixed dollar amount. As an example, the rent was $3.90 per week. You increase it to $400 per week, which is a fixed dollar amount. As long as you can justify the market value to the tenant, this is by far the most effective way to implement a rental increase for residential properties. The best way to justify the amount to the tenant, what we do, we provide them with a comparative market analysis report. Basically, and what that entails is similar type properties, what they've leased out for within close proximity in order to justify the rental increase to the tenant. We also provide that to you as our landlords as well, so we can recommend a particular rental increase for your property. Lastly, the topic I mentioned I was going to cover is what happens if a tenant doesn't want to pay the rental increase that we've suggested. Essentially, what they can do is they can lodge a complaint with Consumer Affairs. Consumer Affairs will usually action this and they'll do some market research and see whether our rental increase is justified or not. The typical method that they do this is they will ring a local senior property manager in that area and they will ask, they'll say, hey, for a 4-bedroom home in Craigieburn as an example, the rent's at $420 per week. Does that seem reasonable to you? 9 times out of 10, the agent will hopefully agree with us and we will be able to then implement the rental increase. However, if the rent assessment from Consumer Affairs does say that the increase is too high and we are unable to come to an agreement with the tenant can then take the assessment and go to VCAT. VCAT can then set a maximum amount we're allowed to charge for a 12-month period. So that's going really far down the line. It's never gotten to that point for us as an agency. We have had tenants challenge rents, of course. However, through our market reports that we do provide, we're able to very much justify the increase that we have recommended our owners implement. That pretty much covers rental increases. I really hope you've enjoyed this week's video. Thank you so much for your time and looking forward to seeing you in the next one. See you guys.